I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor.
I feel like I'm the absolute poster child for coffee and caffeine. I think I'm smarter, and I'm definitely way funnier after I have a cup of coffee. Coffee gets a bit of a bad reputation in the health and wellness space, and I want to dive into that. I am a fierce coffee advocate. I am team coffee. I'm also team Diet Coke. Just while we're at it and labeling ourselves, I'm also team Diet Coke. But I'm team coffee, but my training, it's interesting, as a naturopathic doctor, at one time had me thinking that coffee was maybe a bad thing. And I tried to quit coffee hundreds of times in my 20s in the name of health and in the name of, I don't know what, hormone balancing. And I want to kind of talk that through because it's common when I work with women that they've got some kind of like negative relationship with their coffee because they've heard something online, or maybe they've been told by another person that their coffee intake is a bad thing. And so I want to go through, well, the lack of research on coffee being a bad thing, and I think where we go wrong on this thought about caffeine and coffee being negative, just so that you can see and debunk for yourself those myths when they come in. But man, do I love a good cup of coffee. And as I'm chatting about this, I've traveled a lot in the last month. And one of my greatest, I'm going to use the word panic. One of my greatest panics about traveling is the coffee situation. And, you know, I've gone from, hotels that had no coffee maker where I'm jet lagged and I'm awake at 5 and nothing opens until 7 and I didn't feel comfortable walking 20 minutes to go get a coffee. I've Ubered, like Uber Eats, Starbucks to my hotel when I've been traveling. I know how to work any hotel coffee maker and try to, conjure up some sort of like decent cup of coffee with these crappy coffee makers. I will order like the $8 or $9 cup of coffee room service if I feel like the coffee maker in the hotel is not good. It's very difficult when I'm traveling. This is something that I worry about. It's like, what is the coffee situation? I have a fantastic coffee maker at home. It's one of those things that's like an appliance that, I don't know. It's an appliance that really matters to my husband and I. And at one time when he sold his business, we actually bought like an amazing coffee maker as our parting gift with his business because we wanted to have this like absolutely amazing coffee maker at home. So we have a Jura at home, which makes the most amazing cup of coffee. And honestly, this coffee maker is like, I don't know, it's like 6 years old, and I think it's made about 2 billion cups of coffee. So at this point, that, amazing and very expensive coffee maker really doesn't owe us anything. But that's what the coffee maker that I have at home. And then at work, we have an espresso because then people can choose to make like individual cups of coffee, and people can choose whether they want decaf or non-decaf at a moment's notice. And that's maybe my only criticism of my home coffee maker, is that the beans are in the thing and you can't switch to decaf partway through the day, which is one of my challenges when I'm working from home. And we're going to talk about, your coffee consumption over the course of the day and things to think about. I don't have the option of choosing a half calf or a decaf while I'm at home. It's like full test or nothing. Whereas when I'm at work or at the cottage, where I also have an espresso, I can choose to switch my caffeine intake partway through the day. And that actually is a very positive thing for me. And it's something to think about. So as you're like reflecting and sitting, this is why I'm sharing this, is that like there are decisions that we can make about our coffee consumption that are maybe going to help us, especially if you struggle with anxiety or sleep, and your coffee maker might be where we need to like walk back to that decision, like what kind of coffee maker do we need in order to have the right coffee at the right time. You can see I take this very, very seriously, but it honestly makes a difference that like if you can choose caffeinated earlier in the day and decaf later in the day, that for some people is going to make a remarkable difference, but that's not possible depending on the kind of coffee maker that you have. So the equipment really matters. But I worry about it while I'm traveling because I hate bad coffee and I need to drink it either way. This is the issue. So when we start to talk about caffeine and the effects of caffeine withdrawal, like if there's no water and there's only this like disgusting, coffee beans, like I would literally have to like eat them if I needed to go and present or be smart or work. And there isn't any coffee, I would have to figure out how to like eat those beans or something. And so even when the hotel coffee is so bad, I have to drink it like it's just some kind of terrible medication. Anyways, coffee gets a bad reputation, and often it's in the conversation about hormonal health. And, sitting back now and knowing what I know now, starting to think about the difference between sort of that test tube or in vitro evidence versus what we see clinically. Like this is such an important piece. And in the health and wellness space, sometimes we'll see something happen either in a test tube or in like a rat, and then we extrapolate that data and apply it to some sort of health and wellness concept and teach people things, and we try and pull those things off like they're literal facts when they're not. And we wouldn't accept that kind of evidence or that kind of storytelling in conventional medicine. And that's where I get frustrated, mad, right? / angry. That's where I get frustrated, because we 100% wouldn't tolerate someone saying, well, we've developed a brand new drug, and in a petri dish, in a lab, it improves your hormone levels. And so we want you to take it. Right? Any sort of smart adult would be like, okay, well, yeah, like it did that in a lab, but what does it do like in a full-grown woman? Right? We would have that question. Or if we had a drug where we were like, yeah, you know what, those rats, their hormones, way better. We'd be like, well, what about people? Are there side effects? Like, how did the rats live? And yet, in the health and wellness industry, when you hear some of these statements being made about your hormones and about food and blah, 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 like that's often what we're talking about, is that we can see on paper that there is, and the term is biological plausibility. We can see that like maybe there's a little bit of a story that's connecting your estrogen and your caffeine, and we tell this major tale about these two things and their relationship, and now we've extrapolated what you should do about it, there isn't a scrap of data to suggest that caffeine does anything to like full-grown women and their hormones. There's like a smattering of studies looking at whether estrogen goes up a little bit or down a little bit in people who drink a lot of coffee or who don't have any coffee, but those changes are not meaningful, right? Having your estrogen go up or down, or having your estrogen metabolites go up or down, or having your urine estrogen levels go up or down, like that, we haven't found that actually translates into anything. So unless you're going for some kind of like lab work scorecard where the results are meaningless, but we're going to give you a gold star for it, it's really not valuable to change your caffeine consumption just for the sake of your hormone levels. And I admit that there was a time where I tried to explain the connection between estrogen and caffeine by the way that they're all metabolized in the liver. And this is kind of where we often make this critical error in the health and wellness space, is that we'll say, well, you know, caffeine is metabolized in the liver and estrogen is also metabolized in the liver down the same pathways. And so if we have too much caffeine in there, it's probably getting in the way of your estrogen. And that like kind of sounds plausible, except that we don't actually see that in research. And so the conversation about estrogen and caffeine really needs to go away. It needs to be put down. Because if anything, we see mostly health benefits with caffeine, right? If we look at like big picture stuff, we do think that there is a link between caffeine consumption and all-cause mortality, which is dying for any reason. And so I'd like to bet on that versus worrying about whether or not an estrogen level changes that we haven't figured out if there is meaning behind it. So I do want you to be confident that your coffee consumption is not affecting your hormones. And even if it is in a very small amount, that is not what we call clinically meaningful. So we may see a smidgen difference on lab work, but you don't feel any different and it doesn't change your health status. And so we're going to drop it and we're not going to be worried about it. So I want you to feel kind of good about that. But are there negatives about caffeine? Sure. Yeah, there are some. Are there positives? Yeah. Like there's a lot of positives. So, I mean, for context, caffeine is the most widely consumed psychoactive drug on the globe. There are others, and caffeine is the one that is the most consumed by everyone. I actually occasionally have this worry that we're going to run out of coffee, like as a globe. Like I've never looked into this, and probably because I'm afraid to find out the answer, but are there enough coffee farms to get us all what we need every day forever? I really have not looked into this, but it is a significant concern for me as I take a sip of my coffee. And if we're going to run out of coffee, I'd like to know that we have like a pretty cheap way of creating caffeine tablets that can be distributed, like probably by a drone at this point, to everyone's house every morning. And there be an aroma of coffee while you take the caffeine tablet. This is how I envision. This is like my Jetsons vision of what we're going to have to do if coffee goes extinct. So I hope that that's not happening somewhere and that I'm just not aware of it, that coffee's not going extinct. But it is the most widely consumed psychoactive drug on the planet. And so we know like 100% that it improves alertness. And it does this partly by blocking adenosine in the brain. And adenosine receptors are have that drive towards sleep. And if you've ever heard that term, like sleep pressure, that sort of builds in our brain that causes fatigue or makes us feel less mentally alert. This is part of that circadian rhythm that pushes us towards sleep. So the moment we get up in the morning, we're technically being pushed towards sleep in our brain with this adenosine pressure until we go to bed that night. And caffeine blocks that. So that's why we get the alertness in our brain from it. And there's like adenosine receptors and caffeine receptor action happening elsewhere in our body as well. So that's why you get the athletic performance from caffeine, is that there's a heart rate and a muscular response to caffeine. Caffeine is a very effective ergogenic aid, meaning that it helps with sport performance. The problem is that most of us are habituated to our consistent caffeine intake. And so when you have a cup of coffee and then go to the gym, but you do that every single day, you may not be seeing like massive performance effects from it. Whereas if we restrict caffeine and then put caffeine back in for an athlete, we maybe would see like enhanced performance from them, because we kind of dehabituate them and then put the coffee back in, or caffeine back in. But there are lots of positive physiological and psychological things that happen when we have coffee. It's arguable whether or not it improves things like ADHD. I always cling to that. I'm like, it helps me focus. So I need it. But the research on that is pretty mixed, and I would say it's probably based on individual experience with it, whether or not it helps focus and concentration. And for you as an individual, it probably has to do with whether or not there's like a line, right? Like alertness, anxiety. There's probably this line at which, if we ride that fine line, then coffee probably really enhances cognitive performance. Well, we know it does, but like you in your workplace or you in your life, there's going to be this line where it's improving cognitive performance. And then if we cross that line, it's probably increasing anxiety and maybe decreasing cognitive performance. So that's something that I've always been curious about in the research, is whether or not there's some benefits for patients who struggle with focus and concentration, because certainly that's what I experience in my everyday life. And so I would really love if the research would just collaborate with what I already believe. That is literally like the definition of bias. But I would really love that if we had some big study that was like, adult women who are 41 with ADHD, they should have all the coffee. And if we start to run out, they should get first dibs. That's how I would like that to go. But the research on that for ADHD is mixed right now. So there's those cognitive benefits, right? Decreased fatigue and more feelings of alertness and concentration. There's the physiological things that happen. So we definitely see improvement in athletic performance, and you probably feel just physically better when you have caffeine. For some people, they're going to experience a reduction in headaches and migraines. And some of you may actually use it if you feel like you're starting to get a headache, to have a cup of coffee or to have some caffeine to see if you can circumvent that. But those are the main sort of benefits of having caffeine. And so you can see like day to day why that feels so good, right? Like who wouldn't want a very safe psychoactive drug that improves concentration, makes your jokes way better, and improves, physical performance, right? Like who wouldn't want that? So what are your relationship red flags with coffee? Let's talk through that, because there are lots of positives. Like anything, we can take it to an extreme, or we can kind of misuse some of those benefits and create a little bit of a hole for ourselves, like a health hole, where we're in a deficit sort of health-wise and not realizing it because we have these crutches or props that are kind of keeping us afloat. So let's talk through that. So first of all, coffee is not a meal. And I think, when the effect of the drug caffeine is alertness and physical improvements or physical performance improvements, that can mimic this sort of sensation or feeling that people get, that sort of makes them feel like they've done good things for their body when in fact maybe they haven't. And so caffeine is commonly used as an appetite suppressant or as something to help people who are in a calorie deficit to stay in a calorie deficit and not feel so shitty, right? Like if you're trying to lose weight, if you are trying to keep your calories low, coffee can help you have your calories low and not feel like, hot garbage. The problem is that if using that coffee as a crutch for undereating actually does create some negatives, and it does put you in a bit of a health deficit. And so it's common when I start working with women who are fatigued, and literally the number one thing that women come in with to my office is fatigue. The number one issue they're having is fatigue. And when we start to look at all the reasons why they might be fatigued, there are really only one or two things that women are willing to entertain as a cause of their fatigue, honestly. So I say, well, how's your sleep? And they go, oh, it's not that. Right? Or I'm like, what about the fact that you had like a Baby Bell cheese and a coffee for lunch? And they're like, oh, it's not that. It's got to be my thyroid or got to be my hormones. Like there are definitely things that are causing fatigue in women that we are not willing to point our finger at, and under eating and over caffeinating is one of them. Coffee's not a meal, and if you're using it to skip meals, or intentionally or unintentionally, that's probably creating a health deficit, and it is not the coffee's fault. You don't have to get rid of the coffee, but you need to be cognitively aware that if you underfuel and coffee bridges you to your next meal, but now you're like under on your calories and whatnot, the rest of your health is going to suffer because of that. Again, not the coffee's fault, but the action of the coffee is letting you get away with it on a day-to-day basis without really realizing in the moment what's happening. But if we look big picture at your health, you probably are complaining of fatigue. And so that I want you to think about that, right? Coffee's not a meal. The other thing caffeine does is worsens anxiety. And everyone's tolerance for this is going to be different. I can have like a decent amount of caffeine, and actually I've done one of those like 23andMe genetic tests, and I did it in my late 30s. And honestly, when I did it, I was like, I should have done this when I was in my 20s. I feel like it would have solved a lot of things for me. But when I got my results back, it was like, you're not a fast runner. I was like, thank you, test. And it was like, you should weight train. I was like, yes, I know. Thank you. It was like, you drink more coffee than the average person. So I really felt like it was just telling me things I already knew, but maybe it wouldn't have taken me like 38 years or whatnot to figure some of those things out if I had just run that test in my 20s. But I am a high caffeine metabolizer genetically, and we do all differ in our metabolism of coffee and caffeine. And so some of us are able to tolerate a higher dose than others. And it's just because everyone's body is going to dispose of the caffeine at a different rate. And then if you are a habitual drinker of coffee or caffeine in any form, you will also become more efficient at disposing of that caffeine, which is why we kind of lose some of the athletic improvements from coffee because you habituate to it. So if you have this kind of high steady state of caffeine all the time, your body will upregulate the enzymes that actually degrade caffeine, so you get rid of it a little faster. But genetically, I am one of those people that just disposes of caffeine a bit more efficiently, and so I can tolerate a higher amount without it causing too much negatives. That said, that third cup of coffee for me, especially if I haven't, is it the third or is it the fourth now? Anyways, the mid-afternoon cup of coffee, we'll talk about my daily consumption in a second. That like afternoon coffee for me, if I have it around like 2 o'clock and I'm on kid pickup duty, which means I'm driving to go get kids around 3 o'clock, that usually is a recipe for anxiety for me. And truthfully, that's one of my trigger points anyways, is that, you know, school ends at 3-ish and the workday ends never when you're an entrepreneur, and having to get my kids where I'm not done my work. And that is like just kryptonite in my brain. And honestly, I'm pretty sure that my last like 11 years of therapy is about this exact issue, that like this role explosion in my brain where I'm trying to work, but I'm also trying to parent. That's hard for me. And so that afternoon cup of coffee, when what I need to then go do is that, right? Like put your work down, go drive around all hell's half acre, picking up your kids and not working while emails are pouring in. That is like a recipe for anxiety for me. And how I noticed it was that my thoughts were irrational while I was driving to get my kids. I'd be like, they're probably dead on the playground and nobody has found them, or they've escaped from the school, which honestly did happen one time. They've escaped from the school and no one has found them. Like, these are my thoughts. And it took me a little while to figure out what was happening. Again, I have like decent body awareness, but I was like, why am I so anxious when I drive to go get the kids after school? But I'm not when I like have that afternoon cup of coffee and then go to the gym, right? Which is great, right? I can work out at 5 if I've had a cup of coffee into the afternoon and I feel awesome. And I realized it was because I already have tension at that time of day. And then I was literally taking a drug that worsens anxiety, right? So if I said to you, like, here, take this drug, it's going to totally worsen your anxiety, you probably wouldn't take it, right? You'd be like, pass, I'm good. And yet that's kind of what we're doing with our cup of coffee. And so you need to think about like the time of day that you're taking it and the circumstances that you're taking it and whether this is like net positive for you or net negative. Now, you can slow down the absorption of your coffee, but we absorb literally 100% of the caffeine we take in. That's not true of very many substances, right? If you think about your calcium or your multivitamin, like there's certain parts of it that we maybe don't absorb. We absorb like 100% of your caffeine that you take in. And so don't drink it if you don't want it in your bloodstream. You can slow it down a little bit if you have it with a meal. And sometimes if people are trying to support their anxiety or trying to support the way they feel after a cup of coffee, and then maybe you're in that camp that you're skipping meals because of your coffee, or you're running out the door and having up a cup of coffee on an empty stomach in the morning, let's try and pair that with some food and see if we can slow down the absorption. But you literally are going to absorb 100% of that caffeine in that coffee. And so don't drink what you don't want. That's my advice there. But it absolutely will worsen anxiety if you have that tendency. And so it's important to kind of pay attention to that. And the effect is like decently soon, right? It's going to be within like that first like 1 to 1.5 hours after that caffeine ingestion, where you're going to notice the effects from a mood perspective and affecting your anxiety. So what I would suggest there is that you just pay attention to it and track your anxiety around your caffeine intake. And where is that line between feeling cognitively alert and excited versus feeling like the world is imploding, right? Or your heart is going to beat out of your chest. Like, just keep track of that and then let's make good decisions about it. It's hard because it is a drug and it's not addicting per se, right? It's not addicting like in the true sense of the word, But I think when we're in a cycle of fatigue and trying to have high performance, and then we have this like cheap, accessible psychoactive drug that helps us feel more alert, and like you can easily get yourself kind of into this cycle. And I do think that when we use anything to enhance our performance, cognitive performance or physical performance, we develop a bit of a weird relationship with it where we worry that we're not going to feel like ourselves if we don't use it. I just want you to be smart about it, especially those like late afternoon cups of coffee where perhaps our worry and anxiety is a little bit more likely to show up anyways. Just be mindful of that. If you're a morning anxiety person and that cup of coffee is really throwing you over the edge, like let's pay attention to that, right? And maybe we can mitigate that or drop the dose of your caffeine a little bit so that it's not having that negative effect for you. And again, like I said, it's individual. So paying attention to how it affects you and then making a smart decision about that is really important. The other area where it shows up is sleep. And I always joke, like 100% of my patients who have difficulty sleeping think that their caffeine intake is not contributing to it, right? It's like one of those things that we're just not willing to admit. The half-life of caffeine is decently long, like average is about 5 hours, but for some adults it's longer than that, right? Like I said, I am a speedy metabolizer, but you might not be. And even though I'm a speedy metabolizer, it 100% gets in the way of my sleep if I have coffee later than 3 p.m. in the afternoon. 100% affects my sleep, even though like on paper, the majority of it should be gone by like 10, 11, or half of it's gone by 10 or 11. What's remaining in my blood makes my brain incapable of falling asleep. And that is probably also true for you. So like I said, no one wants to point their finger at their caffeine, even though it is a drug that makes you stay awake. Again, if I said it in a slightly different way, here, take this pill. It'll prevent you from sleeping. You'd be like, no, thank you. Like, I'll pass. And yet we'll have a cup of coffee as our kids go to hockey at the end of the day or something like that. And then people are like, no, that can't be it. Coffee doesn't affect my sleep. Coffee doesn't affect my sleep is like my most favorite thing to hear people say, because it's the most like cognitive dissonance that we can have with respect to one of our daily habits and behaviors. It's literally a drug that makes you awake, except nobody thinks it affects their sleep. It's the funniest thing when I'm talking with people. I'm like, tell me more. Tell me more about how that drug that makes you awake, when we want it to make you awake, it doesn't affect your sleep. So there's probably a timing thing for you with sleep. And again, you're going to have to play around with this and think about it, is that for some people, if they have coffee after noon, and that's like a nice cutoff. I usually create that cutoff for people if we're trying to improve their sleep. It gives them a good chunk of the day without caffeine and lets their body metabolize it so that hopefully there isn't a lot there when we go to sleep. You might have to back that timing up. Maybe you can't have coffee after 11 or after 10 in order to sleep. It's totally going to be up to you, but it 100% interferes with your sleep, like hands down. So you're going to have to figure that out. And going back to my coffee maker discussion at the beginning, is if the actual coffee is the desire, but your sleep is being affected, we may want to think of a way to help you have a cup of coffee without the caffeine later in the day, which may mean that you need to look at your equipment a little bit differently, or choose a coffee maker that allows you to flip between caffeinated and decaf coffee. So in the afternoon when I'm at work, I'm often choosing a half calf if it's like before 2 o'clock, or I'm choosing a decaf if it's later than that. It's pretty rare that I would have a cup of coffee after 3 o'clock at work. Usually if I've missed that window, it's just like, too bad, Jordan, you missed the window. Now you have to go to the gym without any caffeine. So I've created those deadlines for myself, or I have to have a decaf, right? Like in the afternoon, a straight decaf. Now at home, the problem is that I don't have that option. And this is like a stupid excuse, but the coffee from my Jura coffee maker is so good. And I actually will drink more caffeine on a weekend, or on a day that I work from home than I will when I go to the office. And you would think that it would be the opposite, right? Where I'd be like, at the office, water cooler, hang out, have more coffee. It's actually home where I struggle. And my husband does too. And our coffee maker makes this very distinct grindy noise that you can hear like almost throughout the entire house. My poor teenage children who are trying to sleep, and the sound like literally goes into their bedrooms. But I can hear, and I'll hear the coffee maker and look at the clock, and I'm like, oh my God, there he goes, having another cup. But he does the same thing for me, that we probably drink more coffee when we're at home than we do anywhere else, because our coffee maker is so good. So you need to create those cutoffs for yourself. And I will say, like, I will have that later cup of coffee when I'm at home and know that I'm ruining my sleep. Like, I know. And that choice or that decision that I'm making usually is when I maybe don't have to get up early the following day, or my following day is lighter, or I have like a little bit of buffer where I maybe could have a nap or catch up or whatnot. So I try really hard not to get in the cycle of having a late coffee, crap sleep, and then have to get up early and perform the following day. Like, that's not a good recipe for me. But when I'm, working from up north, which I commonly do in the summer, or when it's the weekend, or if I'm working from home, or my timetable is not as intense, I can definitely have that afternoon cup of coffee. It 100% interferes with my sleep, but I just tolerate it. But if you struggle with your sleep, switching to decaf or a half calf later in the afternoon may be exactly what you need in order to prevent yourself from destroying your own sleep. The last sort of negative thing, and can you see me spinning all the negatives into positives or finding a workaround for us? This is how my brain works when it comes to coffee. I'm like, well, it's bad, but it's not that bad. Or it's bad, but this is how we're going to work around it. But the last kind of bad thing is what we put in our coffee. And I've changed my tune about this a lot over the last couple of years. I started drinking my coffee black when I did Weight Watchers when I was 18. That is a story for another day. But that was when I started drinking my coffee black, because it was a point to put anything in my coffee. And pre that moment, I was having like half coffee, half hot chocolate. I was a high school student, right? I was having half coffee, half hot chocolate when I had coffee. So it wasn't really a coffee. It was more like a hot chocolate. And it's from Tim Hortons, right? That like cafe mocha. It was across the street from my high school. It was brilliant. And I had to switch because it was too many points to have this coffee hot chocolate situation when I was doing Weight Watchers. So I switched to black coffee, and I actually loved it. And I didn't miss putting anything in it. I felt like I grew up, and I started drinking my coffee black. And I drank my coffee black for the longest time, actually, like decades of black coffee. And it wasn't until recently, within the last 2 years, that I started wanting something else in my coffee. And I can still drink my coffee black, and I actually really love a black cup of coffee. It's that if there is an other option of putting something sweet into my coffee, I'm going to choose that 100% of the time. Now, we can absolutely turn our coffee into something less healthy as it kind of goes down the spectrum of what we add to it. And I'm going to put on the very, very far end of unhealthy, negative decision around coffee is the like Frappuccino caramel drizzled coffee situation that you can get at a specialty coffee shop or like Starbucks, right? Like that is a meal calorically. It is so much sugar. It's way over there. And then you got black coffee on the other end of the spectrum. And for the longest time, I felt like you couldn't really have in between, right? It was like anything you put in your coffee was bad. I would think to myself, well, if I'm going to have 3 coffees, then I don't want anything in it because that would be 3 times the dose of whatever that thing is that I'm putting in my coffee. And I definitely had this like negative Weight Watchers experience where I felt like the micron of cream or sugar that I was going to put in my coffee was, going to have a negative impact. But that's probably not true, right? If you added up the amount of sugar or calories or whatever we're worried about in your, in the coffee that you have twice in a day, it's probably a drop in the bucket compared to other things, right? And the enjoyment that I get from my cup of coffee, even if that did amount to anything, I'm willing to sacrifice somewhere else if I really need to, in order to maintain or keep the cup of coffee the way that I want it. But if you're drinking frappuccinos, if you're drinking lattes or specialty drinks with like full cream, high fat milk, whipped cream, etc., like we maybe want to look at the number of times in a month that you're doing that and maybe decrease it. Right? It's a great place to start, actually, if you're starting to think about your nutrition, is to think about how many times you're having like a legit dessert coffee. If you're somewhere in the middle, I would say like if you're like a triple, I'm going to put the triple like in almost the same camp as that frappuccino, right? There's a lot of things going into that cup of coffee. If you're a triple, if you're a double, that's still a lot of things going into that cup of coffee. If you're a single, it's probably not as big of a deal as maybe we've made it seem in the past, right? A small amount of sugar, a small amount of cream, or an alternative. What I use is I use the oat milk creamer, which a friend had me try when they were making fun of my black coffee, had me try this oat creamer, and I have not looked back like 2.5 years later. If I'm worried about the coffee shortage, I am almost equally as worried about the oat creamer shortage potentially happening in the globe. But that's currently what I put in my coffee. And so when I add it up through the course of the whole day, the amount it's probably equivalent to a couple of tablespoons of this sweet creamer. Again, nutritionally, drop in the bucket. It's helping me enjoy my cup of coffee, and it's really not having a negative impact on my health. So you do not need to drink your coffee black for it to be healthy. You absolutely can put some things in it. If you struggle with lactose intolerance from a dairy perspective, you maybe want to choose a lactose-free option. However, for most adults, the small amount of lactose that's in a coffee creamer or like a 2% milk or whatnot is really not going to have a negative impact on your digestion. So as long as you're not in that sort of like frappuccino situation down there on that end of the spectrum, whatever you're putting in your coffee is probably not having a negative impact. You could add it up if you really wanted to, and put your sugar in your coffee and then put that same amount of sugar like on a plate, and do that over the course of the whole day, and then ask yourself at the end of the day if that amount of sugar is in alignment with your health goals. Right? It's a great way to get some visual representation. When you put the sugar into the coffee and it dissolves immediately, it's like it's not even there. Put it on a plate or in a little dish. And every time you have a cup of coffee during the day, put the same amount of sugar that you put in your coffee on the little plate and do a visual check-in with yourself at the end of the day. You could do the same thing with your creamer. If people have lost touch with their nutrition, sometimes I just want them to measure the things that they're eating, not to write it down, not to get obsessive about it, but to give yourself a better visual representation of what you're taking in. So get out a tablespoon and pour your creamer into the tablespoon before you put it into your coffee. And then ask yourself again, is this in alignment with what my health goals are? But I don't think we need to be afraid of the things that we put in 1 cup of coffee per day or 2 cups of coffee per day. It's again a drop in the bucket nutritionally compared to the other choices that you're making during the day. Caffeine withdrawal is also a thing. Just to switch topics for a second, as I was thinking about my current intake of coffee and how happy I am with it and where it's at, I've definitely had moments in my life where my intake was too high, right? I had moments where I felt like I literally wore roller skates at the clinic and had multiple patients at a time, multiple treatments, IVs and acupuncture and consults, and doing so many things all at once. There were a few years in there where I relied really heavily on caffeine during the workday. And when I tried to come down off of that, I would feel sick. So it's like take your coffee consumption from 4 cups down to 2 and I would get a migraine. I would be gagging. I distinctly remember this one time where I tried to decrease my coffee intake because it had just ballooned out of control. And I was gagging in the bathroom while a patient was waiting for me in the front. And so it is definitely possible that as you start to decrease your caffeine intake, if you're at an unreasonably high level, that you're not going to feel that well. And I remember that moment, and I think about it often when I'm thinking about my habitual intake over the course of the week, is that I never want to feel that dependent on a drug ever. I never want to feel that level of withdrawal again ever. That was really, really gross. So right now, my current consumption is about 3 cups per day. And if I'm going to exceed that, it's a decaf or a half calf. And so that is a great happy medium for me. If I exceed that at all, the consequences for me are negative. Sleep, anxiety, digestion, right? Everything is bad if I exceed that amount. And I can totally... I'm going to use the word get by, but I can totally get by with 2 cups or 2.5, 2.5 calf. It really just depends on the timing and what I require out of myself and my body. If I work later in the evening and have to perform later in the evening, 100% I'm going to have a little bit of caffeine. And sometimes I'll even make a 2-ounce cup of coffee and just have it for the drug-like effect. But on my regular sort of day-to-day, I want to find this happy medium between cognitive performance and physical performance and not ride that line of anxiety, because for me, it's just not worth it anymore. So I gave you lots of things to reflect on. And also, hopefully, I've given you some peace of mind about your coffee and caffeine intake, that the negatives really are something that you can probably self-regulate, honestly. If you're having negatives from your caffeine, just drop the dose. Just have a little less and see how it turns out. You don't need to go coffee free or caffeine free. It's not having the effects that the health and wellness industry has made us believe, and it's delicious. So why would we take it out? At one time, I considered naming the podcast Coffee with Dr. Jordan, right? Almost like we're going to sit down and have a cup of coffee and shoot the shit. And I can't believe that it's taken me this long to do an episode about coffee, which is the love of my life, food-wise. But I hope that you enjoyed the episode and it's given you some food for thought. And I like to try and keep this balanced approach to thinking about anything with our health, right? If it's helping us, great. If it's not harming us, great. If it is harming us, let's try and measure that or get really connected with what we notice about it. It's very unlikely that for most things that we need to have such a hard line and say this has to come out of your life completely. And so pay attention to what you're noticing with your caffeine intake. And until then, enjoy many, many, many cups of coffee. I'll see you next week.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.